Welcome to Volume 7 in the series, South Island Pioneer Families, with Shelley Henshaw. This series is dedicated to learning about the unique and important history of South Pender Pioneer families and their connection to SDÁYES, South Pender Island, and the surrounding Salish Sea. Shelley, a descendant of the Henshaw family, will speak about her family's history on the South Island, which stretches back over 80 years. She will begin her story speaking about how her grandmother survived the wreck of the RMS Lusitania in 1915, and through a series of events how one of her uncles came to live on Pender, which would eventually bring more of her family members, including her father. 4 of the brothers would eventually purchase land in the Spalding Valley, and Shelley will describe how events unfolded for her family and for herself to have a deep connection with Pender Island. That and so much more. This recording was made in May of 2024 at Shelley's home on South Pender Island and is made possible with grants administered by the South Island Historical Society. I'm your host, Chris Wakaluk, and it's my pleasure to present this series to you. My voice has been extracted from this final recording to give maximum time and clarity for the interviewee to share their stories. Thank you for listening. Now here is Shelley sharing the Henshaw family story.
My name is Shelley Henshaw, and I live on South Pender Island. I live in a house by the sea at the foot of Craddock Street, and I have a small cut flower business, Nighthawk Flower Farm, in the valley on Spalding Road, on one of the farm properties there. I am retired and have lived full time on the island since about 2019. And my father was John Henshaw. He was an island trustee. He and my mum lived on Pender full time since about 76. I have 6 uncles. All but one lived on South Pender Island. Anne and Len Henshaw lived at the east end of the farm properties on Spalding Road. My parents lived on the west end of the farm. I have 3 siblings, 2 sisters and a brother. They all live on South Pender Island as well. And my farm is next to Ron Henshaw's farm. And his father, Gordy, had the farm property. My dad had the farm property, which I'm on now. And so I have been coming to Pender Island all my life as a child and adolescent. Young adult. I have brought my 2 children here, and they're quite familiar and attached to Pender Island, as are their children, and they each have 2 daughters. I think the Henshaw's story begins with my father's mother. Her name was Mabel Baker, and she was actually born in England, but was raised in Ireland, in Tipperary. She had quite a privileged life in Ireland. She lived with her family on Lismacue estate in Tipperary. They spent their summers in Spain, which is where she learned to swim, which was very important, as it turned out. She was well educated. She had a tutor. She had 1 brother who died in World War I. She, in her early 20s, married Cecil George Henshaw, so that was my grandfather. He was a tea merchant from England, and they decided to immigrate to Canada. Unfortunately, Cecil was not much of a let's say, businessman. Apparently, he sold the tea business, and they were about to board their ship to come to Canada, and the money didn't come through for the purchase of the tea business. So I think they started off in Canada with very little money, which is probably why they ended up in Saskatoon. Anyway, World War I started, and my grandfather signed up in the UK. And by this time, they had a baby, a daughter. Constance. And when Constance was 7 or 8 months old, my grandmother decided that she wanted to go to Ireland to visit her father to show him the baby. So she booked her passage on the Lusitania, and it was leaving New York on or about May the 1st of 1915. And she and Constance, the baby, they boarded the ship. And as we all know, the ship was torpedoed by a German submarine. My grandmother was one of about, 2,000, they always refer to as 2,000 souls on the Lusitania. And she was one of them, she and her daughter. She was in the second class steerage. She was interviewed about 3 times by the CBC during her lifetime, the last time when she was about 90 years old. And at that time, the interviewer thought she was probably the last living passenger, certainly in Canada, if not America, to be interviewed. There weren't any other around at that time. Anyway, so she was on the ship. She told us, and she recalls that it was the last full day before the ship was meant to get to port in Liverpool, and they were in the south of Ireland, of Kinsale. She had heard rumors about something amiss, that there was enemy boats about. And when she left New York, she recalled that there had been warnings from the German embassy that America ought not to be sending passenger ships across the Atlantic. But she said to the interviewer that it didn't worry her. She was not the worrying type. And it was a war, so it was not surprising. So she was on the ship. She says she went below at one point to find something in her luggage, and there were all these boxes. And at the time, there was a question about whether or not the Lusitania was carrying arms, but she said there were multiple, hundreds and hundreds of wooden boxes, and she never did find out what was in those boxes. She recalls that she was going for lunch. It was her turn to go for lunch. She had the baby who was asleep in her arms, and that's when the torpedo hit. And she went out into the hallway, and she said it was crowded with people yelling and screaming. Ship went down, and she got a life jacket. A fellow passenger handed her a life jacket, and she took it, and she held the baby, and they were in the sea. She recalls that she held onto the baby for a long time. She says it took about 25 minutes for the ship to actually go down, and then the baby was sucked out of her arms. Her next recollection was that she was picked up by a boat, and she was lying on a dock covered in tarps and blankets and things. And apparently they didn't realize that she was alive, and obviously she was. So she survived the Lusitania. She was rescued by a boat called the Bluebell, which was a little fishing boat that was out. There was a call in Kinsale they saw the ship go down, and so everybody had boats, went out to try to rescue the passengers. And it was the same boat that Captain Turner, who had been captain of the Lusitania, he was on that boat as well, the Bluebell. Anyway, so she stayed in Ireland for several months, but at the end of 1915, she returned to Saskatoon. She ultimately had 9 babies. So Constance drowned, and then she went on to have another daughter, her only other daughter, and that baby sadly died of the Spanish flu. And she went on to have 7 sons. And these boys were born between Saskatchewan and Vancouver. My father, John, was born in 1925. 3 brothers are older than him, 3 brothers are younger. So Victor was the eldest, then came Dennis, and then Len, and Uncle Len is well known on South Pender. My dad, Gord and his wife bought Browning. Bob was from Vancouver and had a tugboat business. And then there was one brother, the youngest brother, Brian, who lived in Timmins, Ontario with his wife and family. And we really don't know very much about him. He was absent and living in the States, or I don't think he ever came to Pender. And he was really, I would say, estranged from the family, perhaps. During the Depression, so my dad was born in 1925, during the Depression, which hit, as you know, in the end of, 1929, early 30s, and it was the deepest trade depression in Canada's history. People were out of work. Apparently 30% of people had no jobs. There was no money. My grandfather was actually apparently a poor provider. He had no real skills, and he had multiple jobs. So it was up to my grandmother to really make things work and look after these boys. And apparently they were a handful. One night, when my dad was about 9 years old, he said, he's in Vancouver, he was given a box and he was told to pack his stuff, and they all got boxes, pack your stuff. And they were leaving that house, which was a rental house, in the middle of the night. And they eventually went to Main Island. Now, I don't know why they went to Main Island, and I don't think my dad knew why they went to Main Island, but I suppose the accommodation would have been cheap, and that's why they went there. So they were these 7 city boys who had never been on a farm or on the Gulf Islands, and there they were on Main Island in an old house, apparently, and the boys learned to hunt and fish and log. There's one story where about fishing, the fish box washed up on the beach, and they got some dynamite, and they rowed out into the bay, and they anchored the fish box, and they threw the dynamite in, and of course the fish all floated to the top. They were stunned, and they gathered the fish up and put them in the fish box. So when my grandmother asked them to go get some fish for supper, they just went out to the fish box. So they were very entrepreneurial, I would say. They all took small jobs, working on the surrounding farms, or whatever they could really do to get paid, they would do. My dad was the school's custodian, and apparently he had to fight for that job every year with fisticuffs to get the job. And that meant that he would get his school supplies and a small allowance. And his job was to light the fire first thing in the morning to get there ahead of everybody and warm the place up, cut the kindling, get the fire going, and sweep up and clean up at the end of the day. They also did rowing jobs, and they would row from Maine to Pender or wherever. And there was a story that was in the Pender Post several years ago about this woman. There was a young woman. She had written a letter, and she was traveling from Vancouver to the Gulf Islands. And during her stay in the Gulf Islands, she went inter-island hopping in a rowboat that was rowed by the Henshaw brothers. They got paid 25 cents for a trip. They had some garden, they grew potatoes, they had some apples, that sort of thing. There was a lot in those days, I think, of farmers helping each other out. So there would be a lot of the barter system and in trade to get food on the table for services. World War II came along, and I think the 5 eldest Henshaw boys all signed up and had various jobs in the war. And when the war ended, they, one at a time, ended up at Britannia Mines. And there was work up there because, of course, there was still hard times employment-wise post-World War II. So they were up at Britannia Mines, and that's when they started to trickle to Pender Island. And the first one would have been Len Henshaw. Len was then with Anne Henshaw, and her grandmother was Arthur and Lilia Spalding. So that's the connection between the Henshaws and the Spaldings. So they married, they had a son. And while they're at Britannia Mines, apparently what they did was they would take a boat, a small boat, down from Britannia Mines, across Georgia Strait, and to South Pender Island. That was a feat to travel that far in a boat. So Anne and Len were the first ones to settle on South Pender Island, and Uncle Len and Anne bought the property that is at the foot of Gallon Point Road, which is along the beach there. There was a big old house there, kind of like a huge plywood house, I would say. And that's where we stayed every summer when we were little kids. And at that time, Len was, he was commuting to Saturna Island. He worked as an electrician, and he was working in the shale quarry that was on Saturna Island. Anne, meanwhile, was working as a postmistress and at Hope Bay or Port Washington in the grocery store. And my dad was working in construction at the Dees Island Tunnel and then as a vocational school instructor doing carpentry. Anyway, my dad built a boat. It's called the Jodo. It's about 21 feet long. And that boat had a little cabin on it. And that's how we got to Pender. We come across the Georgia Strait. There was lots of vomiting, lots of green faces. Didn't seem to bother my parents at all. We went on multiple trips across the Gulf in this boat called the Jodo. And then it was moored in the bay there at the reef, which is called the Lizard. I think some people may be familiar with that. And that's where we spent our summers there. And then in 1967, Uncle Len, just prior to that, decided to sell that property. And he and my dad, Uncle Gord and Uncle Dennis, decided to put their finances together and purchase the farm in the valley. And the farm in the valley was composed of about 270 acres on Spalding Road, the 200 acres or the farmland, and then there was 75 acres, which is now known as Castle Road. Anyway, so these brothers, they bought the farmland. At that time, the Spaldings had probably not owned the farm, which they had started and created since about post-World War II days. They had given it up. And the farm was farmed by Mr. Teese and his wife, Mrs. Teese. And that's who the Henshaw brothers bought the farm from. Although I remember seeing a title search somewhere about Jack Amy's maybe owning the farm. He married one of the Teese's daughters, and maybe there was some sort of arrangement. I don't know. But it had been farmed by Mr. Teese. He had sheep and a few cows and that sort of thing on it. Len and Ann had bought property on the east side of the farm, which is now owned by Faye and Christian. So they were down there on that end of the farm. And my dad and my mom bought 6 acres from Alan Brooks at the other end of the valley on the west end. And my dad had a little cabin built up at the vocational school in Kelowna where we were living at the time. And that was assembled and put up on the property across the road from the farm next to the Brooks property. And that cottage was moved about, 30 years ago to the farm proper. And that's where it sits now. And that's where my sister lives, my sister Janice. When I look back in time, not much changed between a little kid and being a teenager and an adolescent and what happened on the properties that we lived on. We had a very idyllic childhood, I would say, on South Pender Island. And maybe it was the last innocence, I don't know, because when school was out, we came down next day when school was out. We came to Pender Island. We spent the entirety of the summer holidays here. My mom would drive us down from Kelowna, of course, and my dad spent part of his summer holidays. When he had time off, he would be here down on Pender Island. We lived very simply. There was no power, no indoor plumbing. There's no running water. We had outhouse. We had kerosene lamps, fireplace. There was no TV. We didn't bring friends with us, although one summer my brother did bring a friend. And before we came to Pender Island for the summer, we all went to the library and we picked out 8 books. And we did a lot of reading and we exchanged the books between ourselves. We hung out on the beach all the time. I don't think we were inside at all. We had a lot of freedom. We amused ourselves. We fished. We went down to Bedwell Harbor to the store down there and bought buzz bombs with some money. We fished from the dock there. We had rowboats and we jigged for cod. We went off the rocks and we jigged. We fished. We rode the ponies, which everybody knows about. Picon Cheyenne. They were owned by Eve Smith. They were actually rescue ponies. They were Shetland Welsh, and they really, as ponies do, can have a nasty little streak in them, which they did. I was always horse crazy as a kid and went on as an adult to have horses. In fact, I have a paddock, 2 paddocks here for horses. Anyway, the ponies were incorrigible. They dumped children all the time by scraping them under the trees. They stepped on us. And of course, when we went riding, we didn't wear helmets. This is totally non-pony club stuff happening. No helmets, improper footwear. I remember Eve Smith saying, well, the reason why they're so naughty with you girls, because my sister Janice and I rode them, is because, they know you're kids, that you're not adults. So, of course, we put rocks in our pockets to be heavier. That didn't seem to work. But anyway, if we caught them, that was a bonus. And when we were living at the farm, my sister and I, we would walk down to the ponies at Brooks Point, which would be like a good 45-minute walk there, 45 minutes back. And I don't know, we would just disappear for the day, it seemed. But it was okay. Do our own thing. One thing about the ponies I remember is that the fall fair was actually at where the school is on North Pender across from the clinic. That's where the fall fair was that year. So we were tasked with riding the ponies up to the fall fair. And my brother got a little pony called Minto, little Palomino pony. I have no idea where that one came from. And I can't believe it now when I look back that we three of us rode these ponies all the way and across the bridge. No adults with us. My parents completely oblivious to safety, and who knew whether these ponies had ever been over the bridge or not. I suspect not. But anyway, it all ended well. We had a glorious time. We gave rides to little kids and rode them home again. When we were little kids, we didn't really play with other children. From time to time, we'd see the Penders and we'd see the Spaldings. And there would be family picnics and barbecues and things like that. But we didn't see a whole lot of the other children. So we were pretty much on our own. There was a wood stove in the cabin and at the house down by the beach. My mom was really quite remarkable in how she was a city lady for sure, how she adapted to Pender life and cooked on the wood stove, had a wringer washer machine. I think there was no shower or bath. I think we were all pretty feral by the end of the summer. That's what I think. Mm-hmm. As an adolescent here, my sister Janice and I both worked at Bedwell Harbor. And Bedwell Harbor was, when we started working there, was run and owned by Kathy Lettner and her husband. And it was the Lettners, her parents, Dan and Helen, who had started or had the resort for many years before Kathy took over. So we worked there when we were 15, 16. We applied for work, and we worked there as teenagers for several years. And in fact, when I was a student nurse, between the breaks, between school, I continued to work down there at Bedwell Harbor. And it was interesting. It was a bit chaotic, I would say. We had really lots of fun down there because there wasn't much supervision. I remember one morning, Janice worked actually in the little grocery store, and I worked upstairs in the restaurant. We went to work, and there was nobody in the dining room. But when we peeked into the dining room, there was like 6 or 7, 8 people sitting at the dining room tables. But there was no cook. Apparently the cook, and who knows, there was no message or anything like that. The cook just did not appear. It wasn't like there was a cell phone and we could text somebody and say, what the heck, where's the cook? So the kitchen was locked. So Janice crawled through the little window into the kitchen and let me in. And then we decided, well, we would just, cook up breakfast. So I went out. I told everybody that there would be pancakes. There was eggs and bacon and toast, and that was it. And that's what Janice did. So we put the breakfast together, and I don't think people even batted an eye. So those were the days, really, when it was a bit rough and ready. The sea was a big part of our life on Pender Island for sure. We spent a lot of time on the water and the beaches. We learned to water ski. And I think because it's so cold, you learn to water ski really fast. You learn to stay up. My dad always had a boat. We went to Cabbage Island and Tumble for family picnics and outings, which is kind of our favorite places to go. Went to the Saturna Lamb Barbecue. And there were the social events as well from time to time that the families had, especially down at Jigs and Derek Christie. that took over the property from Anne and Len. They had a tennis court, and we had tennis tournaments and lots of badminton, picnics, and activities. The fall fair was a huge event. And first of all, it was kind of sad because we knew we were going to have to go home and back to school once the fall fair had gone. But we would get the book early in the summer and look at the children's section to see what sort of exhibits we could do. And we pretty well did the same thing every year. My brother always did a big board with little bits and pieces of trees and, seeds and things like that. We liked to collect shells, pie plates with pretty pebbles in them in water. We would do little arrangements with seaweed and shells and things like that. There was art, so we'd paint pictures and things. And then there was baking when we were a little bit older. We would do cookies and something pathetic. But it was super, super fun. We really looked forward to it. And it was a big deal for the islanders with their vegetables and fruits, preserves, jams, pies. It was a big deal. There was a huge participation among all the farmers and getting ready. It was very social to go up there. I think that I don't recall as a kid that it was so much a tourist feature. It was really the islanders getting together with their families and friends, and this big opportunity, this traditional fall fair. It was really fun. We didn't want to go home. We were so used to just running wild, really. That's what I would say, is that we got up in the morning, we put on shorts and shoes, and we took off. And we had a lot of freedom. We really didn't have any safety concerns. We had to wear life jackets in the boat. My dad was pretty firm about that. Because of my mom's experience, my grandmother's experience, we all swam. My grandmother made sure everybody knew how to swim, and we could all swim like fish. We were good swimmers. With the water and the rowboats, well, we all rowed. And we would love nothing more than to go out and tie up to a piece of kelp with a book. And we would read. We tied up to the kelp and we would jig. And you could do it with your foot, literally, just like Tom Sawyer, jigging. Yeah. And even when my sister and I were working down at Bedwell Harbor, we started our first year, we were the chambermaids. And in that first year, we were the chambermaids. We actually painted this little structure where the laundry was meant to be done. We painted it white because it was so yucky and filthy. So we painted it white, and then we even patched sheets. That's how tough things were down there. But we would work first thing in the morning, clean rooms and things like that, and change the linens and stuff, and then go back, I guess, in the afternoon. So we had this couple-hour break, and we would go to Tilly Point to go fishing. So we'd row there, and I would say quite often. It happened too many times. We'd get caught in the tide as you go around Tilly Point, and you just row like mad, and you're not going anywhere. And we'd be yelling at each other, row harder, or because somebody would be rowing too hard and spinning the boat, or vice versa, right? And there would be lots of fighting. It was fun. We liked to fish for sure. When we lived on the property at the end of the valley, my sisters and I slept in a tree fort. And there was a stand of cedars. There was five or six, maybe 7 cedar trees. And they were really straight, beautiful trees. And we built a fort. And I think my dad at first thought, what are they doing? And then he saw that we were really quite serious about it. So he helped us finish it up. So we slept in the fort all summer. It was open. There was no roof or anything. But there were 3 beds. They were jigged between the trees. Mine was the lowest, like really quite high up, like at least 30 feet up in the trees. And then there was another bunk and another third bunk. And we had a rope ladder. And that's where we slept all summer. And it was dry then too, because it was only on a few occasions that we had rain that I remember going in the little cottage there. That was as a teenager we slept there. That was our room. Our big outing was to go up to Port Wash or Hope Bay to the store up there and get a treat. which might be actually a piece of bologna, as I recall. or a little, like a goodie. I remember when that Macintosh, those packages of Macintosh toffee. Yeah, sometimes we get that too. But anyway, the food was a very simple fare. There obviously was no Costco run. And we ate a lot of fish, codfish, grills, salmon, lots of applesauce because there are lots of transparent apple trees, and of course, blackberries. So food was very, very basic stuff, and bologna. And milk came from the Jennings. Hope had a couple of milk cows when we were down at that end of the island. And then my Aunt Anne, she also at one point had a milk cow, so we got milk from her. My mom would have been busy doing, cooking on the wood stove and putting things together and doing a wash. And we did a lot of hiking. My parents liked to hike, but my mom didn't hike that much with us. I think it was a vacation. I think it was different then because people didn't have big gardens. And she was she'd take us to the beach when we were up living by the farm. Then she would have driven us to the beach every day down at the other end of the island. And we spent hours and hours every afternoon on the beach. And while we were on the beach, I remember Jigs Christie coming down from the house with her tea tray and her Brown Betty teapot. We'd have tea and cookies on the beach, look for agates, just as kids do, playing on the beach and on the reefs around there. It was endlessly entertaining for us. And my mom would be on the beach. She loved the beach too. So my dad, when he came down, he helped Len on the farm do things, helped him with equipment, that sort of thing. He always had a project, whether it was something to do with the well or something to do with the cottage. And then, of course, in 1967, when they had the farm, my dad worked on the farm. As soon as they bought the farm and took over, there was always fencing. So the four brothers had the farm, Len and Dad and Gordy and Dennis. Dennis, to a lesser extent, didn't work really on the farm. And Gord, by this time, was super busy with Browning Harbor. So I don't think he did much, if any, work on the farm, but he might have done some heavy equipment, moving, excavating, stuff like that. But as a kid, I remember my dad, once they got the farm in 1967, he was super busy. There was always a fencing to do. There was always equipment to repair. There was haying in the summer times. We helped with the haying. We all learned to drive in the hayfield, in the truck. There was a stone boat that was towed behind a tractor, so we hated that. Every once in a while, we went behind the stone boat and were tossing rocks onto the stone boat. They had animals. At one point, there was 100 ewes, and they were all lambing. And there were 30 or 40 at its peak of Black Angus cows. And the animals would go from one end of the farm to the other. My part of the farm has what's called a high field, which was a really good hay field. And Ron has some good hay field as well. And Dennis had some good hay field as well. So those would have been fenced off while the hay was growing. And then once the hay is taken off, the animals would be back on that. But there was just never ending farm work. And I think they just loved it. And these guys were so capable of fixing the mower, fixing the baler, all those things. They just were good with equipment and machinery and figuring things out. And they were good with hard work. Very good work ethic. They also had a sawmill. And that was on the farm. And so eventually when my dad retired and built the house, those cedar trees where we had our fort, they came down, and that's what he used. He milled those and built the house, which you see today, 9831 on Spalding Road. He was assistant dean at the Okanagan College in Kelowna. So he would be down here for his summer holidays, but not for the entire 2 months the way we were. Yeah, he worked, but he's the type of guy that loved to work. Right up to the very end, he worked. The big deal was the shearing. That was always really exciting when they sheared the sheep in, June. And they would get some sheep shearers from Salt Spring, and there was a couple of fellows from Langley or from Vancouver Island. So that would be really something really interesting to watch. We loved lambing. My mom quite often had a lamb in the kitchen. That was, maybe part of a triplet, and needed extra supplements. My mom learned how to do, there was sometimes the lambs, the eyelid folds over. So they need to have a suture to put in to pin it up the right way, just to get started. And so there was, putting the elastic bands on their tails and doing all the vetting and things like that, which was really quite interesting to me and foreign to my dad. By this time, Uncle Len and Anne, they were very knowledgeable and had a lot of expertise when it came to the animals. But my dad was somebody who wanted to be part of it. I think to the frustration of Uncle Len. Uncle Len was, he was very calm. Sheep would get out on the road, and I think my dad would get a little excited, and there'd be a little bit of yelling and running and stuff, but not Uncle Len. He would just be sauntering along the road, and they would all go back in wherever they came out of the hole in the fence, and then the fence would be fixed. They had different styles. So there was then going to the market, which was a sad part. I didn't like that part. So that's why, I have the farm now that my dad had, and that's why I have a flower farm. I don't have animals. I don't want to take anybody to market. But speaking of market, Ron now has some cows, which is good because, I have a hayfield and so does he, and I don't think there are very many other animals, farm animals, on South Pender Island. So that seems to be the end of an era of having farm animals. In about 78, 79, they moved here and my dad retired full time. He was 55 years old and he wanted to, immerse himself in farming and build the house. So he built the house. They lived in they moved the cottage further from the house site and built the house. And that took him about probably a year and a half. While I was a student nurse, I came to Pender and I went to BCIT and I was a registered nurse, and I really missed Pender, so I came on weekends and stayed with Anne and Len, and I completed the program there at BCIT, and I nursed in various places. I got married. I was in Prince Rupert in England, got married, had 2 babies, and then I came back with my 2 children. I was in Ontario and Eliza was born. And then I came back to Vancouver. I left their father and I came to Pender, and I actually stayed in B's house, which is Rob Dale's house. I stayed there for maybe 6-7 months or something. I lived on the farm in the cottage, and then the weather changed. It was October. I still hadn't decided what I was going to do. So then I stayed rented in B's. And then I went back to university. I went to UVic and got my degree in nursing. So we lived in Victoria for a couple of years, coming to Pender because Mom and my parents were here. And they were always wonderful, helping look after my children. And then I decided to go to law school. So I went to UBC and lived in Vancouver. And while I was going to law school, my children came to Pender, spent a lot of time on Pender, staying with my parents. And whenever I had holidays, like summer holidays and time off, I came to Pender. So there was always contact. And then I eventually, when I got called to the bar, I worked in Vancouver and then the Fraser Valley. My kids were growing up and we continued to come to Pender. My mom was a nurse, but she did not work while we were growing up. She actually, after everybody left the house, she took a refresher course in nursing, but then decided it was not for her. And then they came down to Pender Island. And she certainly helped with the building of the house, like all the painting and all that sort of thing. She was certainly hands-on. My children were extremely close to their grandparents. My parents were really wonderful to them, helping with them. They spent their holidays. And I think I moved around a lot. So this was kind of like a real home base. It was predictable and To this day, they love Pender and they come here for their holidays. And so do their children. So I have 4 granddaughters. My son has 2 daughters, and my daughter has 2 daughters. They're all the same age. So the next generation, so in a way we are 4 generations of Henshaws. My parents, me, my children, and their children. So some 80 years we've been on Pender. My Aunt Anne was a huge influence on me. And as I said earlier, Anne was a granddaughter of Arthur and Lilius. I would say she was an environmentalist before her time. When we were kids, she was living down at the farm. She was on like their farm, separate property from the farm proper. She was the type that, would take us out on hikes and walks on the property. And there had a huge, big maple tree on her property. It was a gigantic, a beautiful tree to be sitting up in, covered in moss and parts and things. And I still remember to this day her going over to the tree and giving it a great big hug, putting her arms around it and saying, I love this tree. Now everybody come and give it a hug. And so whenever we walked there, we would give this tree a big hug. She, was super fun and knowledgeable on the beach when we went on beach walks and went on the reefs and would show us little bits and pieces of things and, the life, the living organisms on the beach. And, she became an artist. She was a wonderful homemaker. She was always baking. She always had treats for us. And then she started to paint late in life, doing watercolors. And she did a good job. There's painting over there of her chickens. She had chickens. And she loved her chickens. They all had names. And she would pick them up and pat them. They were producing eggs. They had their job to do, but she absolutely loved them. When I was living in Stratford, Ontario, that's where my daughter Eliza was born, I got this little parcel in the mail. It was spring. And in it was a box, and it was moss, beautiful moss, with little violas and little snowdrops and all the first spring flowers and little primulas in it. And I just thought that was so wonderful. And she said she, sent this card saying, she's sending me a little bit of Pender because she knew I missed it. When I was a student nurse and didn't have any money, she ordered some redwoods seedlings from California. And they came up, a tray of them, and she gave me 2 of them. And I planted both of them, and it was on my dad's birthday that I planted them. One survived, and one did not. But I think the one that survived is probably the biggest redwood on South Pender now. So when you go by the property, 9831 Spalding, the houses that my dad built, you'll see the great big redwood there. It's enormous. She participated in the fall fair with everything, like cooking, canning, vegetables, fruit, berries, and flowers. And she loved putting flowers in with the vegetable garden. It was super fun to go visit her garden because there were always, it was beautiful to look at because of the flowers in with the veg and things. She was very artistic, and she loved nature. And she loved walking out and being out. And I remember as a student nurse going for a hike with her and Hope Jennings, who I also loved. And we went up on a hike and we were sitting on the moss, leaning against it. And she was just saying, isn't this the best bed? This is like the best piece of moss. This is the best bed. And they were just so, interesting and gracious with their freckled, sun-damaged skin, and they always had silver bracelets with turquoise in them. They were just lovely ladies, and especially my Aunt Anne. I just loved her. So my mother died, I think now my dad died in 2007, and my mom died about 13 years before he did. And my mom turned out to be a wonderful gardener. And I didn't know that about her, but she had a beautiful, beautiful garden at the back of the house. And Dad helped with that as well. And I think they were happiest when they were out on the boat. And they had various boats. They went from motorboat to sailing, back to motor, back to sailing, and then back to finally their last boat, which was a Blue Heron 2, which is kind of like a big, trawler type boat. And they spent a lot of time up at Desolation, and they would travel up there for long periods of time, like a month or something. And my kids and I joined them quite often for my summer holidays. So we would be up. We take a bus up to Paul River and they pick us up in the boat and go into Desolation Sound. And we had a wonderful time. And it was really then again all about putting around and swimming and hiking on the various islands up there. And it was super fun because again, it was, I think, this super wonderful innocence, no TV. We played cards, games, that sort of thing. And by this time, my kids were teenagers. So it was very cool to be doing that with them in the summer. My mom was a great golfer, loved golfing. So she was at the golf course a lot. She was a great knitter. At one point, she was washing fleeces and spinning them. She loved the piano. And once she went to Vancouver, she didn't have a piano. She went to Vancouver, and I don't know that my dad even knew this. We drove the truck to Vancouver, bought a piano, and brought it back. It's like she wanted a piano, and she went and she got it. And she loved playing the piano. And we had a lot of sing-songs and good times. She died of cancer, and I had one last trip with them on Desolation before she died, and it was really a wonderful trip. We had lots of fun. It was good. My dad, he was pretty devastated after my mom died. And what does he do? He will work even harder. So he sold the house and he built a house and he built it himself again. He had help, but he was up there working all the time. But my son worked with him, and so did my nephew, Janice's son, Len, who was born on Pender Island. That was a tough summer for all of them because he was a hard taskmaster. Anyway, he built a house, and Mom and Dad had been very active, like on the golf course, golfing, and in the sailing, the yacht club, and went off, they had yacht club excursions, and that was very social and fun, and they enjoyed doing that. And my dad served as a trustee, I think at least 3 times, if not more. And at the time of his death, he was the oldest serving trustee. And he was very interested or, very involved with the building of the fire hall. So the fire hall here on South Pender Island, and he was a chief at one point. And that's when they got all the guys together and they had a practice on Thursday. It was all very casual. It's not like it is now, which is really, really tough for volunteer firemen. But then it was just whoever was capable of attending and picking up the hoses. And anyway, that was a real community effort and spirit that he spearheaded as chief when he was chief. And then there was building of the fire hall. And that sign there that says Pender Island Fire Hall, he made that sign and carved out the letters. Dad had a very sudden and surprising death, and he was logging at his new house just before where there's a border, there's a road right before the farm, kind of the valley, the level part of the farm starts. So anyway, there's a road along between the ridge and the farm, and there are lots of falls, of trees falling during the winter times, of course. And so he was clearing the road, and he got hit by a tree, died. Yeah. So that he would have been very annoyed because he was very safety conscious. But at his celebration for life, a couple of his friends, my dad was, I think, 82 at the time he died. A couple of them said that they kind of envied him that he went like that. He was still very vigorous and engaged and interested in things. Yeah. So, yeah, right to the very end, he lived a full life. He had his boat. He was golfing. He was doing the yacht club things. He was doing his work as a trustee, putting lots of effort into that. And he still had the farm. And there weren't animals at that time on the farm. He and Len had given up the animals, but there was still the haying to do and looking after the fields. And they still had their sawmill, which they used. So the wood that he built the new house with, that also was milled by him. And they called the sawmill Thick and Thin because that's how the wood came out, thick and thin. Or the Brothers Grimm. The farm was called, they referred to it as the Brothers Grimm farm. I think Pender obviously is a super special place. I would say a magical place. And I don't know whether, like, here I am, my siblings are here, my cousin is here, and, you know, I'm doing my best on the farm so what happened was the four brothers then divided the 200 acres, which was the farm, into 4 50-acre parcels. And before my dad died, there was the ridge part where he built the new house, so he divided that from the farm, so it was 10 acres, and the farm where I am right now is about 37 point something acres, and Ronnie has 50 acres, and then the other two farms down the valley. Those farms, they still had work to be done on them even though there weren't animals going back and forth. I think that, as I said about, you know, Pender, I don't know whether it's in your genes or what it is, but it's either you're happy here and you're somebody who likes your own company. Definitely you want to love the sea and nature because it's abundant here. It's a very special place for sure. Yeah. And I feel very blessed and fortunate to be here because it just feels like home.
Thank you very much to Shelley for doing this interview. This interview and the entire series has been made possible with funding from the Capital Regional District, the Pender Island Community Resource Center, the SÁNEĆ Leadership Council, SÁNEĆ School Board, the Pender Islands Museum, and the South Pender Historical Society. Thank you to all these organizations for contributing to make these recordings possible.